Before I actually jump into this, I wanted to ask, do we have anyone in here that was out fighting these fires this past week? If you were, please stand up. I just want to thank you. If we don't, that's fine, but okay. Well, if you see anybody that was out fighting these fires, please thank them, because that was some scary stuff over the last week and a half. So, have you ever heard a call from God in your life? One that you were certain was from Him, you had no doubt about it that it was from Him, and yet for some reason you were unwilling to follow it fully? Or you needed some persuasion from God before you would decide to follow it? I know if you're anything like me, I've had a few of those different times in my life, and most of them revolve around me being called into ministry, or a change to a different kind of ministry that He was calling me to. But I think we can all relate to that in some ways. We've had different calls in our lives where we knew it was from God, but for whatever reason, we had a hard time pulling the trigger on that. The first one for me was my actual call to ministry, and I was a senior in high school. I actually had just finished high school and was on at church camp, and we had left camp and gone to a mountain for worship that evening, and God was just smacking me in the back of the head the whole time, saying, "You need to be going into youth ministry," and it scared the living daylights out of me. Because at the time when I was in high school, I was so shy that to stand here in front of you guys today, I would have been shaking so bad that I couldn't even get a word out. It took me over a week to answer that call. But when I did, He changed my personality completely to where I actually love being in front of people and love talking in front of you guys. Another time was more recently when He called me from youth ministry to preaching, and that was something that I never thought would happen, because when I went into youth ministry, I wanted to be a youth minister for my whole career. That was what God had called me to. That's what I was going to do. Well, He had different plans, and He made it very apparent to me, but at the same time, it was hard to pull that trigger to make that switch. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to follow God's call in our lives? Trust? I heard, yeah. I'm sure that, again, that you answered yes to that first question this morning, that you've had that time in your life. But could it be so hard because there's a couple of different things that we've gotten wrong in our own thinking? And these thoughts are often connected. First, we don't trust God to take care of us. We may say that we trust God, but do we live that out? It's a pretty common occurrence. I know, at least for me, I want to trust God. I say that I trust God. And sometimes I'm even able to follow through with that trust in God. But all too often we say we trust God, but we're afraid to take that step of faith. We're afraid to take a step where we don't know where necessarily it's going to take us. Why are we so afraid to take that step, though? One of my favorite movies, and I'm sure most of you will remember this, but you remember the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And at the climax of the movie, we have Indiana Jones running through this cavern, and he comes to this crevice between the two places where he's at, and he needs to get to the other side, and there's just nothing there. But he's supposed to take a leap of faith. That's what the clues have all told him. If you remember the scene, he sticks his foot out, and he starts to take a step, and it looks like he's just going to fall, and then all of a sudden his foot hits an invisible bridge. He takes a step of faith that if he wouldn't have done so, he was stuck where he was at. And he was able to take that step of faith because he trusted the notes that he had been given, the clues that he had been given. But I think it's so hard for us to take that step of faith because taking a step of faith often means that we don't know our destination, right? We don't know where it's going to take us. Not being able to see the landing. Kind of like where Indiana Jones didn't know for sure if he stepped off that ledge that he was going to hit solid ground. Do you know anything about the African impala? Go ahead and put that first picture up, Dave. That's the African Impala. It's not to be confused with the Chevy Impala. Just to make sure we're clear on that. The African Impala can jump 10 feet high from a standing position, can just jump straight up 10 feet. It can sprint, at a sprint, it can jump and cover a distance of over 30 feet. But it can be kept in any zoo in the world with a 3-foot solid wall. Why? Because it will not jump if it cannot see where its feet are going to land. And a 3-foot wall blocks its view from where it will land, so because of that, it will not jump. A 3-foot wall can keep a creature that can jump 10 feet high and 30 feet across, can keep it bottled up. It will not jump if it can't see where its feet will land. And I think a lot of us in our lives become in that predicament. We don't know God's final destination for us or where we'll land if we follow God's call in our lives, so we don't jump. We don't take that leap of faith. We hear God calling us to do something, but our fear keeps us from doing it, keeps us from what He is leading us to do. And there are consequences for that lack of faith and that lack of trust and that lack of action. Now, thankfully, we serve a God that gives us many, many chances as well, but there are consequences when we don't fully trust Him. What we find in the life of the strong woman that we're wrapping this series up with this morning is actually two women that seem ready to act and are courageously ready to trust God at the drop of a hat. And we also see a man who God was ready to deliver an enemy into his hands, but he wasn't ready to trust God, and we see the consequences for that as well. So if you have your Bibles with you, if you want to turn to Judges 4, it will all be on the screen, but I want to set the stage a little bit for you. The book of Judges, it's just a cycle of God raising up a person to help Israel, to help get them out from under different kings in the area. The judge will rise up, will help Israel. Israel will trust God. Then that judge dies and Israel falls away and stops trusting God again. And it's just that downward spiral. And we come to this one. Ehud had been the last judge before Deborah and before Judges 4. And Ehud was a judge that ruled for, I think, he ruled for, they had peace in the land for 80 years after Ehud. I don't know how long he actually ruled, and then they started doing, Ehud died, and they started doing evil in the eyes of God again. And that's where we pick up in chapter 4. We're going to read the whole chapter, and it says, "Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud was dead." And if anyone ever tells you that the Bible is boring, tell them to read the story of Ehud and then to read the story of Deborah, because there is some cool stuff in there, especially if you're a guy and you like fighting. There's some cool stuff in these stories, but that's beside the point. "So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Hashereth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time, and she held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." So God tells him through Deborah, "Do this, and I will deliver your enemies into your hands." And Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." So he puts a condition on it. If Deborah will go with me, I'll go, but if not, I won't. Verse 9, certainly I will go with you, said Deborah, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree of Zananim near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And at Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. But Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. So Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid. So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. I'm thirsty, he said, please give me some water. And she opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. Stand in the doorway of the tent, he told her. If someone comes by and asks you, is anyone in there, say no. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Okay, how is that boring? If you're reading that, how is that boring? Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. Come, she said, I will show you the man you were looking for. So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with a tent peg through his temple, dead. I would hope so. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. So we have Deborah here, we have Barak, and we have Jael. Those are the three main characters that we see. Deborah was basically the ruler over Israel. She was the judge over Israel at the time. It calls her a prophet, meaning that she was getting direct revelation from God. And she was following them. She was believing what God said and was turning around and relaying those messages. Barak was the military leader of Israel at the time. And he was told directly by Deborah that God would give Sisera into his hands. So God spoke to Barak directly through Deborah, but he would only obey if Deborah went with him. And there were consequences for that reaction. And I think we read through that, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But Jael enters the story as the one who will actually be credited with ultimately freeing Israel from the hand of Sisera. And Sisera had been very, very violent to Israel. And she did so again by nailing him to the ground with a tent peg through the temple. You see, Barak was unwilling to take a step of faith. He was unwilling to believe for sure that God was going to deliver Israel's enemies into his hands. And I think we're a lot like Barak. I think we are. If we can't see that final destination, if we can't see the end, we sit there in fear and we don't jump. He agreed to go if Deborah went with him. Why not? If a prophet of God is going with you, that would make it a little easier. But he was supposed to go without that requirement. He agreed to go if Deborah went with him. Deborah was a faithful leader of the country. She trusted God. She was a judge. She was a good judge. And what God called her to do, she did faithfully without question. Jael held up her family's treaty with Israel by taking out Sisera and giving his body over to Barak in the end. So there's a few things that we need to take from this story. So that's the question. What can we learn from Deborah, from Barak, and from Jael? We need to start trusting God completely with our lives. And I can stand here and say that, and it's so easy to stand here and say it, but it's so much harder to put it into practice. We need to stop being like those African impalas who are kept in captivity by a 3-foot wall simply because they won't jump if they can't see their landing. I have a friend in ministry back in Ohio. I call him a friend. I've never actually met him in person, but his name's Brandon Kelly. I think I've mentioned him in a sermon before. But he wrote an article back in March of last year that he titled "The Often Forgotten Truth About Praying for God's Direction." And he gave a lot of good information basically about what we're talking about here. So I'm going to read a section of his information. He says, it's early in the morning, it's late in the evening, it's that time when you bow your head and speak to your Heavenly Father. Picture it. Be there. Answer this question. When you're praying for God's direction, what are you really seeking? You're seeking a destination or a direction? The often forgotten truth about praying for God's direction is God always gives us a direction, but we're usually looking for a destination. God always gives us a destination, but we're usually God always gives us a direction, but we're usually looking for a destination. We shouldn't be surprised. In Genesis 12:1, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you." And when God called Abraham, He gave him a direction, not the full destination at once. The destination wouldn't be revealed until Abraham got up and set out in the direction he was told to go. But we often forget that God has already given us the general direction for us to go in our lives. While we're looking for a destination, God is giving us direction. The difference between the two is huge. When God called Abraham, He gave him a direction, not a destination. And then He goes on to answer the question, why direction is better. He says it's better to genuinely pray for God's direction rather than secretly desire a destination instead of His direction. Because God's direction grows our faith, our dependence, and our focus on Him. Destination grows our faith, dependence, and focus on the destination and not necessarily God. If we knew the destination, if we knew the what, how, and when of everything in life, we'd be master planners, and we wouldn't go to the throne of the Master. Whenever, and he finishes up, he says, whenever I'm praying for God's direction, I can always rest assured that He has surely given me direction for this life. It's made up of 3 things. Love God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love others as I love myself. And make disciples. That's the general call that all of us as Christians are called to do. If we stick with that and we genuinely pray to our Father for direction, we can always count on receiving direction. Maybe we felt like we're not getting an answer because He knows we're really just seeking a destination. In other words, we want the whole plan laid out in front of us, but we don't always get to see that full plan. Embrace the tension of only knowing the direction and not the destination. And I think this applies a lot to what this area has gone through the last few weeks. With the wildfires and everything else that was going on, it was hard to necessarily trust God. It was. I mean, it was, I kept telling Kelly, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, God, how are you going to do this? This community's had a rough few weeks. The threat of the wildfires. It's easy to be distracted. It's easy to be distracted from God's love for us. It's easy to get down and depressed. It's easy to forget that we serve a God that is fully in control at all times. even with all the devastation from the fires, we're still here. God provided rain over the weekend. Maybe not as much as we would have wanted, but He provided rain. We're still here. God loves and He cares for us. And He's laid out a direction that He wants us to go in our lives. And He gave us a small glimpse of that last Sunday evening. And if you weren't here, I want to share it with you. Go ahead and put that last slide up. We had 2 teenage girls give their life to Christ last Sunday night. And I think it came at the perfect time, not only for them, but as a reminder for us that God is ultimately in control and has our best interests at heart. Leah and Sienna gave their lives to Christ in baptism last Sunday. That's something to celebrate. That's something to celebrate. If you've never done that step, what they did last week, I'd love to talk to you after this or now as we stand and sing our hymn of invitation. If you've never made that decision to trust God with your life, what better day than now to do so as we stand and sing There's Power in the Blood. Number 329, we're going to sing the first and fourth verse.